I was the assistant chief for operations at the time, and the morning of the event, I was in my office, and my wife called me to say that an airplane, the news was reporting an airplane had flown into the World Trade Center. So I turned on the television and watched, like so many other Americans were watching, as the New York event was unfolding. And because a lot of work that we had done in the area around preparations for terrorism, the incident began to feel really strange. Looking at the silhouette of the airplane as it struck the World Trade Center didn't look to me like there had been any attempt on the part of the pilot to avoid the building. And so we began to do a lot of things in Arlington to get our resources back, all of our fire trucks, companies back in their normal response areas. And one of the things that occurred as the second airplane went into the World Trade Center was that people in high-rise buildings in Arlington began to call our 911 center because they were concerned about what their risk was. You may remember that at the time, the news didn't have a good explanation, the media didn't have a good explanation for the crashes. Their explanations were ranging from guidance systems that were off to something wrong with the plane's computers, that sort of thing. On September 11th, 2001, the USA Today headquarters was in Arlington, and their two 30-story towers sit right on the Potomac River and are on the final approach to airplanes that come into National Airport. And that building called in and wanted to know what they should do. Our communications center called my office trying to figure out what do we tell them. And my answer was, tell them to evacuate the building if that's what would make them more comfortable. I didn't have another answer. Somebody pulled the fire alarm as a way to evacuate the building. That started a response towards that building. And as that response was moving towards that area of the county, one of our engines returning from the training academy radioed that they saw American Airlines Flight 77 going down in the vicinity of the 14th Street Bridge, which is what connects Arlington to the District of Columbia. We were always concerned about the Washington, D.C. area, the National Capital Region, as a potential target. It's why we had begun building some special capabilities all the way back in 1995 that were primarily focused on the weapons of mass destruction threat, chemical agents, biological agents, but it was something we were certainly attuned to. When we witnessed the sarin attack in the Tokyo subway system in 1995, we grew concerned that not only was terrorism coming to us, but that subways were a natural target, a lot of people in confined areas. And so we actually wrote a letter to President Clinton saying that if that kind of an incident had occurred in the Washington metropolitan area, where we have this very important asset in terms of a transportation network, the subway, we don't have the training, we don't have the equipment, we don't have the knowledge necessary to react, to respond effectively to that kind of an event. The president tasked the Department of Health and Human Services through the U.S. Public Health Service to work with the National Capital Region to develop just such a capability. The result of that was something that was then called the MMST, the Metropolitan Medical Strike Team. It was the nation's very first civilian staffed terrorism response team. The team had capabilities that most hazmat teams didn't have. We carried special detection capabilities, mass casualty decontamination capabilities. We carried our own set of pharmaceuticals to respond to those kinds of events. And it was a team that was put together from around the region. We had 120 firefighters, paramedics, cops, its own command element. We had specialized communications capabilities that could communicate on any communication system in the region. And that team was stood up to respond to those kinds of events, but it also was available to support national special security events. It, for a long time, was positioned underneath the House chambers during all State of the Union addresses. When the president would go to address Congress, that team would be forward deployed underneath the chamber where the president was speaking to the Congress. And its role was to extricate people and provide medical care and decontamination for Congress and members of the public that may be viewing that event. So we had sort of what I would argue is a greater awareness for the threat of terrorism, and we're thinking about how to build capabilities before 9/11. Well, the Pentagon is one of the nation's largest office buildings, and they don't have their own fire department. The Arlington County Fire Department has been the primary response agency to the Pentagon for decades. So we're very familiar with the building, we're very familiar with the people. Now the building houses a workforce of 25,000 people, which creates its own set of complexities. But we respond to the Pentagon almost every day. We go frequently for EMS medical kinds of runs, but we've been to some significant fires in the building also over the years. So we have a high degree of familiarity with the building. I arrived on the incident scene on the morning of September 11th, 2001, about 10 minutes after the airplane had struck the building. It struck the building on the west side, so I knew immediately that it was not where the Secretary of Defense or the Joint Chiefs were located, but nonetheless, that this was going to be obviously a mass casualty event. The fire was significant, smoke, hundreds of feet in the air, and casualties that just were strewn across the west lawn of the Pentagon. One of my first concerns was that one of the military installations, Fort Myer, actually their fire department deployed a helicopter standby, an engine on helicopter standbys there at the Pentagon, and this was at the area of the helicopter landing pad. And so I had a great deal of concern about the safety of the crash fire rescue crew that was there. But these casualties that were on the lawn and the streams, the masses of people that were coming out of the building obviously gave me great concern. I also didn't have a really good understanding, I didn't have good eyes on what was still going on inside the building. My battalion chief that morning was Bob Cornwell, who had about 35 years on the job and had spent a good portion of his career in the area where the Pentagon is located. So there wasn't anybody in the department who knew the building as well as Bob. So as I assumed command, I assigned companies to Bob and directed him to the building to get a better assessment for the interior conditions. Obviously to size up what our situation was with regard to trapped occupants and the need for search and rescue operations, and just how far the plane had penetrated the building and how far the fire was already extending. The nature of an aircraft into a building is a lot different than many kinds of fire situations that we face, because there's obviously the impact and the concussive force of the airplane as it plows through the building, but there's also this jet fuel that's injected in that is obviously creating additional hazards both for the occupants and accelerating the fire. So sending Bob in with these crews was really sort of my first order of business as far as the interior was concerned. My other priority was making sure that we had adequate resources to deal with the casualties that were on the West Lawn. And because we are a cross-trained organization, we have the EMS role in the county also. And so all of that fell to me as the incident commander to try and organize and get the right set of resources to begin to deal with, the enormity of the event. The incident scene, like any mass casualty event, is initially chaotic. I'm certain that there, on the emotional side of things, there was at least some initial disbelief at what was going on, what was confronting us. But the challenge and the priority really is around beginning to bring some order and some control to this chaos. So there isn't a lot of time to dwell on the enormity, or the fact that this is an unbelievable kind of an event. You've got to go to work right away. And so, assigning resources and at the same time, building some confidence in the people that you're asking to do these things, because for them, it's just as large an event, and you want to try and do whatever you can to corral their emotions and give them a sense that that they can do this, that you've got confidence in them, and that their training and their experience is what they're going to have to rely on. Even though we may not have ever exercised on an event this large or been to an incident this large, you apply the training and the procedures and the experiences that you have just on a larger scale, and you assess the situation and you work as best you can to deal with the situation at hand. Emotionally, there are a lot of challenges because it's a very stressful event. But I remember that there simply wasn't time to be thinking about what else was going on, outside the bounds of this incident scene. I've often been asked, about the evacuation of D.C. and what it all looked like. I have no idea. It was not within my frame of reference. I did not know of the collapse of the World Trade Center until almost 10 o'clock that night. I was in the command post and I was briefing the fire chief and General Jackson, who was the appointed liaison from the Department of Defense to our efforts in the response. I was briefing them on where we stood in the incident. And behind me I heard a conversation and people talking about the suspected number of firefighters lost in New York. And I had to stop the conversation with the chief and the general to turn around momentarily and ask, what are you talking about? And was told then that the World Trade Centers had collapsed, probably 10 or 12 hours before. That was so out of my range of understanding, and it probably was the first moment since initially arriving at the scene that there was any emotion, that ran through me, any sense that, the gravity of what we were facing at that point. Before that, it was just, hours and hours of, challenges that needed to be met, and really setting aside anything that might have been churning inside my head. We had done a lot at building some really strong relationships with behavioral health professionals, namely our Employee Assistance Program, leading up to this event. Beginning in 1999, we had begun to work with them in a way that they came to understand our business, and I think we began to knock down some of the inherent barriers that exist between people in public safety and people outside our world when it comes to trust and a willingness to share some of the emotion and some of the experiences that we have. And so these folks that were all licensed professional counselors had, 2 years before the event, begun to hang out with us. They would come to fire stations, they would ride our fire trucks on occasion, our ambulances, so that they could sort of get a sense for what our job, what our world was like, and also to establish a bond with them and between them and our members, so that they sort of became, if not a part of the organization, they certainly became recognizable, and we understood what they did. Those folks showed up on the incident scene 4 hours into the incident, and their director became a kind of special advisor to me as the incident commander to look at the incident scene and the people that were doing very, very hard work from a perspective that I certainly wouldn't look at. I mean, certainly I'm looking at things from a safety standpoint. I want all of my people to be working in the safest environment possible, but I'm not necessarily looking at issues of stress, behavioral health, those kinds of things. And we're certainly at those moments not going to inject any kind of countermeasures or therapeutic, applications in the middle of the crisis. Nonetheless, it was good for me to understand the kinds of things, the kind of challenges that some of the folks were going through. One of those challenges that was brought on by the circumstances had to do with the fact that some of our people were experiencing minor injuries, pulling a back muscle or maybe cutting their hand. On any given day in our business, when that happens on a fire or on a auto accident, we'll take that person out of the game. We'll get them the medical attention that they need. We'll be guided by the doctors instructions about when they can return to work. And this all has sort of the overlay of the regulatory environment as it relates to the workers' comp laws and regulations that affect benefits and treatment of our personnel. Well, when you're dealing with something like 9/11, nobody's going to want to be taken out of the game because they pulled a back muscle or got a cut to their hand. They want to stay in it and keep on working. But there became some time when some of these folks began to grow concerned about whether or not they were meeting all the reporting requirements as required by the workers' comp regulations. That I only became aware of because our employee assistance director said, look, here's the circumstances, here's the situation that is cropping up out there, and we need to figure out how to deal with it. I called our workers' comp folks, asked them to come down to the incident scene. We explained the situation to them. They worked out sort of a workaround policy, a temporary approach to dealing with these situations, and suddenly, the stress that was, hanging over some of these folks because of their concern about jeopardizing these benefits went away. Because we had the right people, on the scene, we had the right people having the conversation that resulted in some temporary but necessary policy changes that built confidence in the workforce to keep doing the necessary work that they needed to do. We liken the response to 9/11 at the Pentagon, as I'm sure they do in New York, very similar to a military campaign. It's not going to a fire for a couple of hours and then going back to the fire station. And we're very good at supporting our personnel for those relatively short periods of time. And certainly we've done fire scenes where we've been at the incident for longer than a day. When you get a large-scale fire and you've got to be around. But we figured out how to resource those events and support our members for an extended period of time. But when you're out there for 5 and 10 and 20 days, this brings a whole new set of problems that you really need to be thinking about. How are you going to provide the proper nutrition to keep people healthy and with enough energy to be able to do the grueling and grinding work of an event like this? You're not just going to do this on power bars and orange juice. You need to be thinking about, how do I provide high quality nutrition and where am I going to get that from? Because on the event that would last 6 or 8 hours, we might just tap into a McDonald's because that'll work for a while, but you're not going to do that for extended periods of time. So you've got to think about where you're going to get the nutritional advice, where you're going to get the food preparation capabilities. You're going to build a logistical support system that is far different from that you're normally going to be called upon to build. So you need some expertise there, and you also need to bring in not just folks that are going to focus on nutrition, but you've also got to bring in folks that are going to focus on the proper preparation of food so that you don't stray into food that hasn't been prepared properly. I mean, one of the worst things you could imagine in this campaign would be to have a foodborne illness go through your incident scene because food wasn't prepared properly, to proper temperatures, or that food preparers weren't washing their hands appropriately. All well-meaning, all with the best of intentions, but unintentionally start something that you can't control because that would have brought the response to its knees. So are these elements of the logistical support and the focusing on your people that are new or certainly different than what you're focusing on a daily basis? These are things that I think leaders have to really consider for extended operational periods. The last 10 years have been replaying the incident both in my mind and through a variety of exercises and reviews that we've done that have almost always been geared towards improving our capabilities. I think our capabilities and our response on 9/11 was extraordinary. I'm very proud of the way that we performed. Not everything was perfect, and there are things certainly that needed to be reviewed and improved, but we did extraordinarily well, in my estimation. And I think by a lot of even the third party, the independent reviews. There's an after action review that was done, the 9/11 Commission. Although I've long been disappointed by the 2.5 pages out of thousands that they gave to the review of the Pentagon incident, nonetheless says we did a great job there. But there were a lot of things that we needed to improve upon, because the fact is things changed on 9/11. The threats that we thought about before that Tuesday morning were different than the ones that we've been thinking about for the last 10 years and probably will for the next generation. So to the extent that I have reviewed or relived the experience, it has largely been to figure out how to do something a little bit differently. And then as I hear about what is the next threat out there, how do I think through building new capabilities through the lens of the experience of 9/11. We spend a lot of time in a kind of a network, if you will, with not just other fire professionals to tap into what they're thinking about these new threats, but also people that are now part of this Homeland Security enterprise, law enforcement officials, people from the intel world. I've had the opportunity to go sit and talk with new CIA analysts, people that are learning the craft of intelligence analytics, and be able to talk to them about why people in my business, people in the local public safety arena need intelligence, why we need information to build our capabilities, to understand how to better prepare for the threats that are out there today and the threats that will be there in the years to come. So there's a whole new network of people that I need to connect with, that people in our business need to connect with, in order to get the information that we need and build our organizations in ways that can not just react, but also be more adaptive, which is exactly what I think we did on 9/11. We had never trained for an airplane, and certainly a commercial airliner, into the nation's military command headquarters. But what we did was take what we had experienced and what we had built capabilities for, and we extended and or adapted it to fit that situation, and I think did really well. So the challenge now and in continuing into the future is to look back on those experiences and see what we can continue to do, to be the most adaptive organization possible, and continue to evolve our capabilities with that in mind. I think the only other thing that I didn't talk about out there, and I think is useful, is that the world that we live in right now and the threats that we will continue to face for some time to come requires some extraordinary leadership. And I think that leadership needs to first acknowledge that in the world of Homeland Security, in which the fire service is an enormously important player, we need to develop relationships, we need to develop partnerships with people in other professions, with people in other political jurisdictions, and we need to form really strong collaborative relationships. I'm a big believer in regionalism. I'm a big believer in working across boundaries, both disciplinary and jurisdictional, to build better systems, to build systems that are interdependent, because I think we have to acknowledge that no jurisdiction, no organization, no discipline has the capability to deal with the kinds of threats that we face today. That certainly was true on 9/11, both in New York and at the Pentagon, and it was true with anthrax as we faced it in the Washington metropolitan area the next month after 9/11. It wasn't true during Hurricane Isabel in the Washington, D.C. area, or Hurricane Katrina in the Gulf Coast area. So leadership has to be strong and has to be willing to acknowledge that we are dependent on other people, and we need to be assertive in reaching out to others in these other disciplines and these other jurisdictions, and build these collaborative relationships that really result in strong systems of interdependence, and understand that we bring a lot to the table, but we don't bring it all, and we are going to have to depend on other people to bring things that together will build real strong response systems, real strong prevention systems that I think will make our communities and our nation safer.